The town only uses one street after dark. No one explained why. I took the job because it was the only one that called back. That's the honest answer, and I think honesty matters here, in the telling of this. I want to be clear about what I knew and when I knew it, because later, when things started to feel different, I began to doubt my own sequencing of events. I want to set it down now, while I still trust my memory. While I still trust that the order I remember is the order things actually happened. The position was a 6-month contract with the county's Rural Water Authority, inspecting and logging the condition of infrastructure across a handful of small municipalities in the eastern part of the state. Pipe conditions, valve integrity, pump station assessments. Unsexy work, but it paid reasonably well and included a housing stipend, which, in most of the towns I'd be rotating through, meant a rented room or a furnished apartment above someone's garage. I'd done similar work in other states. I was used to small towns. I was used to being the outsider who showed up for a few weeks, poked around in utility basements, and left. People were generally polite, sometimes curious, mostly indifferent. The town I need to tell you about is called Harlow. It sits in a shallow valley about 40 minutes from the nearest interstate, connected to the wider world by a 2-lane state road that passes through a long corridor of soybean fields before dropping gently into the town's grid. Population was listed at just under 2,000 in the last census, though I suspect the real number was lower. There was a main street, which the town called Meridian Road, running roughly north to south. A small commercial stretch occupied about 4 blocks in the center, with a hardware store, a diner called Cora's, a farm supply co-op, a post office, a bar with no sign out front that everyone just called the bar, and a Family Dollar that seemed to do the most consistent business. Residential streets branched off both sides of Meridian in a simple grid, maybe 8 blocks deep to the east and 6 to the west, before the houses thinned out and the fields started again. There was a church on Elm, another on Spruce. A school complex sat at the north end of town, kindergarten through 12th grade, all in one sprawling brick building with portable classrooms along one side. I arrived on a Tuesday in late September. The light was good. The trees were just starting to turn. My contact at the Water Authority was a man named Dale Pressler, who ran the town's public works department, which in practice meant he and 2 part-time employees managed everything from snow removal to water main repairs. Dale was in his late 50s, built like a man who'd done physical work his entire life and had recently started to feel it in his knees. He met me at the Public Works building, which was a cinder block garage on the east side of town, and gave me a set of keys, a map of the water system, with handwritten annotations, and directions to the apartment where I'd be staying. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a house on Polk Street, 3 blocks east of Meridian. The owner was a widow named Mrs. Edith Garland, who lived on the 1st floor and had converted the upstairs into a rental unit sometime after her husband died. It was clean, small, functional. A bedroom, a kitchen with a 2-burner stove, a bathroom with a shower stall, and a living area with a couch and a television that received about 9 channels. The windows on the west side looked out toward Meridian, and if I craned my neck, I could see the unlit sign of the hardware store. The windows on the east side faced a backyard, a chain-link fence, and then the Petersons' house, which Mrs. Garland told me about on my first day, as if I would naturally need to know who my neighbors were. I spent the first 3 days doing what I always did in a new town. I walked the system. I followed the map Dale had given me, cross-referencing it with the county's GIS data on my laptop, locating valve boxes and hydrants and pump stations. Harlow's system was old but not unusual for a town its size. Cast iron mains from the 1940s in the center, PVC extensions from the 80s and 90s in the newer residential areas. There were 2 wells on the north end and a water tower on a small rise to the southeast that you could see from almost anywhere in town. I took photographs, made notes, opened valve covers, and recorded conditions. Normal work. The kind of work where your mind can wander because your hands and eyes know what to do. During those first days, I noticed nothing out of the ordinary. People were friendly in the way small-town people are friendly to someone they can identify as temporary and harmless. I ate breakfast at Cora's most mornings. The waitress, a woman named Jackie who was maybe 35, learned my coffee order by the second day. Black, no sugar. The men at the counter talked about corn prices and the high school football team's chances against Redfield. A dog slept on the sidewalk outside the hardware store every afternoon. The owner of the hardware store, a man everyone called Birch, though I never learned if that was a first name or a last name, would occasionally bring the dog a bowl of water. It was on the 4th evening that I first noticed something. I had been working late, finishing an inspection of a pump station on the west side of town, and by the time I packed up my equipment and started walking back to my apartment, it was past 7:30. The sun had set maybe 20 minutes before, and the sky was that deep blue that comes just before full dark. I was walking east on a residential street, Maple, I think, heading toward Polk, when I realized I was the only person outside. That in itself wasn't remarkable. It was a weekday evening in a small town. People were home having dinner, watching television. But as I turned onto Polk and walked the block and a half to Mrs. Garland's house, I noticed that the street was not just quiet. It was empty in a way that felt thorough. No one on porches, no cars moving, no dogs being walked. Every house had lights on inside, curtains drawn, but the street itself was vacant. I went upstairs, made dinner, and didn't think much more about it. The next evening, a Friday, I finished work earlier and decided to walk to the bar for a drink. It was maybe 6:45 when I left the apartment. The sun was low, about to drop below the tree line to the west. I walked the 3 blocks to Meridian and turned south toward the bar, which sat at the corner of Meridian and 2nd Street. When I arrived, the bar was moderately full, maybe 15 or 20 people. Country music on the jukebox, a pool table in the back with 2 younger men playing. The bartender was a tall, thin woman named Sheila who poured me a beer without asking what kind, which I took as a sign that there was only one on tap. There was. It was Budweiser. I sat at the bar and drank slowly and watched the room. Nothing unusual. Conversations about work, about someone's truck needing a transmission, about a church fundraiser. I had a second beer. Around 8 o'clock, I noticed that the bar had gotten more full, not less. People were still arriving. This struck me as mildly odd, only because in most small towns I'd worked in, the Friday night crowd peaked early and thinned out by 9. Here, people were still coming in at 8, 8:15, 8:30, and they were all coming from the same direction. Through the front door, which faced Meridian. I was sitting where I could see the door, and every single person who entered came from the left or the right along Meridian. No one came from 2nd Street. No one came from the south side or through any back entrance. I didn't think about this consciously at the time. It registered the way small patterns register when you're in an observational profession. You notice flow, you notice direction. It sits in the back of your mind. Around 9:15, I paid my tab and left. Meridian was not empty. In fact, it was the most active I'd seen it at night. People were walking along the sidewalks, mostly in pairs or small groups. Some were going to or from the bar. Others seemed to just be walking. A couple was standing outside Cora's, which was closed, talking quietly. A man was walking a dog near the hardware store. 2 teenagers sat on the bench in front of the post office, looking at a phone. All of this was on Meridian. I turned east onto Polk to walk home, and within half a block, the activity was gone. Not diminished. Gone. Polk Street was as empty as it had been the night before. The houses were lit inside, curtains drawn. No one was on a porch, no cars passed. My footsteps were the only sound other than a faint hum I attributed to the electrical transformer on the pole at the corner of Polk and 3rd. I walked the block and a half to Mrs. Garland's house, let myself in, went upstairs. From my west-facing window, I could see a slice of Meridian, and there were people on it, moving, talking, living their Friday night. But Polk Street, the street I stood above, was empty in both directions, as far as the streetlights allowed me to see. The next morning, Saturday, I went to Cora's for breakfast and sat at the counter. Jackie brought me my coffee without being asked. I ordered eggs and toast, and then, in what I hoped was a casual way, I said something like, "Town gets pretty quiet at night off the main drag." Jackie nodded. "People like to stay on Meridian in the evening," she said. "It's where everything is." "I noticed that," I said. "Walked home last night and didn't see a soul once I turned off." She smiled in a way that was polite, but didn't invite further discussion. "Meridian's got the streetlights," she said. "Better walking." I accepted that. It was a reasonable explanation. Meridian did have better streetlights. The residential streets had lights every other block, older sodium vapor fixtures that gave off a yellow-orange glow. Meridian had newer lights, spaced more closely together, with a wider, more even output. If you wanted to walk somewhere at night, Meridian would be the more pleasant choice. But I had been in dozens of small towns, and in every one of them, people used all the streets at all hours. They walked dogs around their blocks. They sat on back porches. They drove home from different directions. The total, absolute absence of anyone on any street other than Meridian after dark was not normal. I knew that. But I also knew that every town has its quirks, and I was only there for a few weeks. I let it go. Over the next several days, I confirmed the pattern through simple observation. Every evening, as the sun went down, the residential streets emptied. Not abruptly, not in a way that suggested panic or urgency. People simply went inside. Cars that had been parked on side streets were moved to Meridian or pulled into garages. If someone needed to go somewhere after dark, whether to the bar, to a friend's house, to the gas station at the south end of town, they used Meridian. I watched from my window. I watched from the bench in front of the post office. The pattern was perfect. Not a single person deviated from it in the week and a half I observed it. I want to be precise about something here. The feeling on the side streets after dark was not ominous. It was not eerie in the way horror movies make empty streets eerie, with fog and flickering lights and half-heard whispers. It was simply quiet, residential, still. The houses were well maintained, the lawns were mowed, the streetlights worked, casting their pools of amber light on clean sidewalks. It looked like a normal small-town neighborhood in which everyone happened to be inside. The wrongness was not in the atmosphere. The wrongness was in the consistency, in the totality of it. Every person, every night, without exception. On the following Wednesday, I was finishing an inspection of a water main junction on Elm Street, about 4 blocks east of Meridian. Dale was with me. We'd been looking at a corroded coupling, and by the time we closed up the valve box cover and loaded the tools into his truck, the sun was setting. Dale glanced west at the sky, then at his watch, and said, "We should head back to Meridian." He said it simply, the way you'd say, "We should grab lunch," or "We should check the weather." There was no tension in his voice, but there was a specificity to it. Not, "We should head back," or "We should get going." We should head back to Meridian. As if Meridian were a destination that needed to be reached, rather than just a street we'd cross on the way to wherever we were actually going. I said, "I'm just 3 blocks that way," pointing east toward Polk. "I can walk from here." Dale hesitated. It was brief, less than a second, but I saw it. He looked east, then at me, then back east. "Ride with me," he said. "I'll drop you on Meridian. You can walk down from there." I want to emphasize that this made no logistical sense. My apartment was 3 blocks east. Meridian was 4 blocks west. Dale was offering to drive me 4 blocks in the wrong direction, so I could then walk 7 blocks back to a point 3 blocks from where I was already standing. But he said it so naturally, so matter-of-factly, that I just got in the truck. He drove us west on Elm to Meridian, turned north, and dropped me at the corner of Meridian and Polk. "Have a good night," he said, and drove on. I stood at the corner. It was fully dark now, maybe 7:50. Meridian was alive with its usual modest evening activity. A few people walking, lights in the bar windows, the glow from the Family Dollar, which stayed open until 9. I looked east down Polk. My apartment was a block and a half that way. The street was empty, lit by 2 streetlights, one near and one far. Clean sidewalks, dark porches, curtains drawn in every window. I walked home. It took maybe 3 minutes. Nothing happened. The street was quiet. My footsteps echoed faintly. I let myself in, went upstairs, and sat on the couch for a while without turning on the television. I was thinking about Dale's hesitation, about the way he'd looked east down Elm Street, as if calculating something. Not danger, exactly. More like distance, like he was assessing whether the remaining daylight was sufficient for the walk I'd proposed. The next day, I tried a different approach. I went to the Family Dollar to buy paper towels and laundry detergent, and while I was in line, I asked the cashier, a young woman whose name tag said Bryn, whether the town had any kind of nighttime noise, ordinance, or curfew. She looked at me with an expression I'd come to recognize. It was the same expression Jackie had given me at the diner. Polite, open, mildly puzzled, as if the question was unexpected but not alarming. "No curfew," she said. "People just keep to Meridian in the evenings. It's more convenient." "More convenient," I repeated. "Yeah," she said, scanning my paper towels. "Everything's on Meridian, so. What about if someone lives on, say, Oak Street and wants to sit on their porch after dark?" Bryn paused. Not a long pause. A beat. She blinked once, then smiled. "People just prefer Meridian," she said. "642 is your total." I paid and left. I stood on the sidewalk outside the Family Dollar and looked up and down Meridian. It was afternoon, bright and warm. People were on all the streets. I could see kids riding bikes on a side street 2 blocks away. A woman was carrying groceries up her porch steps on what I thought was 3rd or 4th Street East. The town was fully dimensional, fully inhabited in the daylight. Every street, every yard, every porch was in use. It was only at night that the town compressed itself down to a single line. That Friday evening, I went to the bar again. I was 2 beers in when I sat down next to a man named Curtis, who worked at the grain elevator east of town. Curtis was maybe 45, talkative, the kind of man who'd tell you his whole life story if you let him start. I bought him a beer, and after some conversation about the weather and the harvest, I asked him about Meridian. "Oh, sure," he said, as if I'd asked about something as mundane as the town's recycling schedule. "Yeah, at night you want to stick to Meridian. That's just how it is." "How long has it been that way?" I asked. Curtis thought about it, took a drink. "Since I was a kid, at least. My dad, too. It's always been that way." "But why?" He looked at me with an expression that was genuinely confused, as if the question was malformed. Like I'd asked him why people sleep at night or why water runs downhill. "It's just how it's done," he said. "You stay on Meridian after dark. You don't go on the other streets. What happens if you do?" This was the question I'd been building toward. I asked it carefully, keeping my tone casual, almost joking. Curtis didn't react with fear. He didn't lower his voice or glance around the room. He just shrugged and said, "You just don't." "I walk home on Polk every night," I said. Curtis looked at me. For the first time, his expression changed. It wasn't fear. It was closer to the expression you'd give someone who told you they'd been driving without a seatbelt. A mixture of concern and bewilderment that you'd take the risk for no reason. "You should stay on Meridian until you get to your corner," he said. "Then go straight to your door. Don't wander." "I haven't been wandering," I said. "I just walk home." "That's fine," he said. "Straight there, straight back. That's fine. Just don't wander." He finished his beer and turned to talk to someone else, and the conversation was over. I want to note something about all of these exchanges. No one I spoke to was frightened. No one whispered. No one grabbed my arm and told me to leave town. There was no campfire story quality to any of it. These were people describing a rule they'd followed their entire lives, a rule so integrated into their daily routines that questioning it was like questioning why they locked their front doors. They didn't know why exactly. They just knew you did it. The rule had the weight of something inherited, passed down not through explicit instruction, but through observation. Children watched their parents stay on Meridian after dark, and they stayed on Meridian after dark. It was that simple and that total. I started watching more carefully. On Saturday night, I positioned myself on the bench in front of the post office at around 7:30, just as the last light was draining from the sky. I wanted to watch the transition. And I saw it, the way you can see a tide come in if you're patient enough to watch. The residential streets didn't empty all at once. It was gradual. Over the course of maybe 20 minutes, from roughly 7:40 to 8 o'clock, the side streets went still. Porch lights turned off. Not house lights, just porch lights. Every house that had a porch light turned it off, but the lights inside stayed on. And on Meridian, the streetlights seemed to come on with a particular regularity, one after another from north to south, as if on a timed sequence. I'd assumed they were on photocells, triggering automatically at a certain light level, but the sequential activation was too even, too paced. It took about 90 seconds for all the Meridian streetlights to come on, and they did it in order, from the north entrance of town to the south. I watched the Meridian streetlights the next night, and the night after that. The sequence was the same, north to south, about 90 seconds, always beginning at the same point, just as the last natural light disappeared from the sky. The residential streetlights came on differently. They flickered on in no particular order, some before the Meridian lights, some after. They were on standard photocells, as far as I could tell. The Meridian lights were on a system. I mentioned this to Dale the next day, framing it as a professional observation. "Your Meridian streetlights seem to be on a sequential timer," I said. "Who manages that system?" Dale was reviewing my pipe condition reports and didn't look up. "County put those in about 10 years ago," he said. "They're on a controller." "A controller where?" "Box at the north end, by the Water Tower Road." "And the residential streetlights are separate?" "Standard cells," he said. "Meridian's on its own system." "Why?" He looked up. "Better lighting," he said. "Town applied for a grant, upgraded the whole corridor." This was plausible. Towns apply for infrastructure grants all the time. Upgrading the lighting on your main commercial corridor is a standard use of those funds. But the sequential activation, north to south, 90 seconds, every single night. That wasn't standard. Standard smart street lighting comes on all at once or in zones. A sequential activation suggests a deliberate program, something someone designed and maintained. I wanted to see the controller box, but I didn't push it that day. On the following Monday, I drove up to the north end of town to inspect the water tower. The tower sat on a low hill just east of Meridian, at the end of a gravel road that branched off near the town's northern boundary. While I was there, I looked for the streetlight controller Dale had mentioned. I found it mounted on a utility pole at the junction of the gravel road and Meridian. It was a standard-looking metal enclosure, painted green, with a small antenna on top and a conduit running down the pole to an underground feed. There was a lock on it, a heavy-duty padlock that looked newer than the box itself. I didn't open it. I had no reason to. It was outside the scope of my work. But I noted its location and the fact that the antenna suggested it was receiving a signal from somewhere, not just running on an internal timer. Someone, or something, was telling the Meridian streetlights when to turn on and in what sequence. That Tuesday night, I did something that, in hindsight, was the beginning of a sequence of decisions I can't fully explain. I decided to walk the length of Meridian after dark, from the north end to the south end and back, to observe the street in its entirety during its active period. I started at 9 o'clock. The evening was cool, maybe 50 degrees. I wore a jacket. I began at the north end, where Meridian met the state road, and walked south. The streetlights were on, casting their white, even light in overlapping circles on the pavement and sidewalks. The commercial stretch was about 8 blocks south, and I walked through residential blocks first. Here, even on Meridian, the houses had their porch lights off, but their windows were lit, and the sidewalk was not empty. I passed a man walking a dog, a small terrier that glanced at me without interest. I passed 2 women walking together, talking quietly. A car drove by, heading south. A teenager was sitting on the low wall in front of the church at Meridian and Elm, earbuds in, looking at his phone. All normal, all on Meridian. I walked through the commercial stretch. Cora's was closed. The hardware store was closed. The Family Dollar was dark. The bar was lit, and I could hear music through the door. A few people stood outside, smoking. They nodded at me as I passed. I continued south, past the gas station, which was open but empty, except for the attendant visible through the window. Past the last houses, where Meridian narrowed and the streetlights became less frequent before ending at the town's southern boundary, marked by a faded green sign that said, "Now leaving Harlow." I stopped there. I turned around and looked back at the town. Meridian stretched north, a corridor of white light bisecting the dark grid of residential streets. From this angle, I could see it clearly. The town at night was 2 things at once. It was a single lit line, Meridian, running north to south, and it was a dark grid around it, blocks and blocks of houses with lights inside and nothing outside. The contrast was stark. If you'd taken a photograph from above, it would have looked like a capital I. One bright stroke surrounded by organized darkness. I walked back north. It was maybe 9:30. The activity on Meridian had thinned, but not disappeared. A couple walked past me near the gas station. A car drove north. The smokers outside the bar had gone inside. I reached the corner of Meridian and Polk and stopped. I stood under the streetlight and looked east down Polk toward my apartment. 3 blocks, 6 minutes of walking. The sodium streetlights were on, casting their amber pools. The sidewalk was visible. The houses were dark porched, lit within. Nothing moved. No sound. I looked north up Meridian. I could see 2 more blocks of lit sidewalk, a car parked in front of a house, the faint glow of the church's stained glass window where an interior light had been left on. I stepped off Meridian and onto Polk. The transition was not dramatic. There was no sudden drop in temperature, no ominous sound. The air was the same. The night was the same. But within 10 steps, I became aware of a quality to the silence that I hadn't noticed before. It was not merely the absence of sound. It was the presence of quiet. I don't know how else to describe it. On Meridian, the silence between sounds felt natural, the way silence feels on any street when no one happens to be making noise. On Polk, the silence felt maintained, held, as if something was actively keeping the street quiet, the way a hand over a mouth keeps a person quiet. I walked. My footsteps sounded different here. On Meridian, my shoes on the sidewalk had produced a normal sound, a flat, unremarkable report. On Polk, the sound was thinner, higher, as if the sidewalk were hollow underneath, or as if the air carried the sound differently. I stopped and listened. Nothing. I walked again. The thin, high sound of my own footsteps. I reached Mrs. Garland's house. The porch light was off, like every other porch light in town. But the windows on the first floor were lit behind drawn curtains. I let myself in, climbed the stairs, and went to my kitchen window on the west side. I could see the edge of Meridian. A figure was walking north. The streetlight was white and steady. I looked out the east window. The Petersons' house was lit inside, dark outside. Nothing moved. I stood at the east window for perhaps 10 minutes, watching the backyard, the fence, the Petersons' house. I don't know what I was looking for. Evidence, maybe. Evidence that the rule was justified, that there was a reason everyone stayed on Meridian. But there was nothing. The backyard was a backyard. The fence was a fence. The night was a night. I went to bed. I slept. If I dreamed, I don't remember. The next day, I asked Mrs. Garland about the porch lights. I framed it as a practical question. I noticed most people turn their porch lights off in the evening. Is that to save energy, or? Mrs. Garland was watering a plant on her kitchen windowsill. She was a small woman, mid-70s, with white hair and the kind of face that had settled into a permanent expression of mild pleasantness. "We just turn them off," she said. "No need for porch lights if no one's on the porch." "Do people ever sit on their porches after dark? In the summer, maybe?" "People go to Meridian in the evening," she said. "If you want to sit outside, you go to Meridian." "Has it always been that way?" She considered this as if it were a genuine question worthy of thought. "Since I've been here," she said, "and I've been here since 1968. "Your husband, did he know why?" "Why what, dear?" "Why everyone stays on Meridian at night." She turned off the water and set the watering can down. She looked at me with the same expression I'd seen on Jackie, on Bryn, on Curtis. Polite puzzlement. Not at the question itself, but at the need to ask it. "It's just what we do," she said. "You'll get used to it." I noticed she didn't say, "You'll understand it." She said, "You'll get used to it." These are very different things. Over the next few days, I continued my inspection work and continued to observe. I began to keep a log, separate from my work notes, recording the time and location of every person I saw outside after dark. Without exception, every person was on Meridian. I also began recording the streetlight activation sequence each evening. North to south, 90 seconds every night. I tried to identify the exact moment it began and found that it correlated not with a clock time, but with the ambient light level. The first Meridian streetlight activated at the precise moment the sky reached a certain darkness, and the rest followed in sequence. The residential streetlights, on their photocells, came on at varying times, some a few minutes before the Meridian sequence, some after. There was no coordination between the two systems. They were independent. On the following Friday, 12 days into my stay in Harlow, I went to the bar and sat next to a woman named Patricia who worked at the school. Patricia was in her 50s, direct, and after 2 glasses of wine, willing to talk about almost anything. I steered the conversation toward town history. Harlow's been here since 1870-something, she said. Railroad town originally. The rail line ran where Meridian is now. When the railroad pulled out in the 20s, they paved over the rail bed and it became the main road. So Meridian was the railroad. The rail bed, yes, the town built up around it. And the rule about staying on Meridian at night, how far back does that go? Patricia took a sip of wine. I don't call it a rule, she said. It's more of a practice. A practice. Everyone does it, so it's a practice. But when did it start? She thought about it. My grandmother talked about it. She was born here in 1912. She said it was always that way. Stay on the main road after dark. Did she say why? She said it was because of the trains. The trains? When the railroad was still running, you stayed near the tracks at night because that's where the lights were. The depot had lights. The switching yard had lights. Everything else was dark. No electricity in the houses until the 30s. So at night, if you were out, you stayed by the tracks. This made perfect sense. It was the kind of practical origin that gives rise to traditions that outlast their original purpose. Stay near the light source. Stay near the infrastructure. It becomes habit. Habit becomes tradition. Tradition becomes rule. But the houses have electricity now, I said. Have for 90 years. And there are streetlights on every block. Patricia looked at me. Her expression was the one I'd seen before, but with something additional. Something I might call patience. The patience of someone who has heard this logic before, perhaps from her own mind, and has moved past it. The streetlights on the other streets aren't the same, she said. They're dimmer, I agreed, but they're functional. They're not the same, she repeated, not impatiently, just firmly, as if she were stating a fact about the physical world that I had not yet perceived. I asked her what she meant. She finished her wine, set the glass down, and said, "The light on Meridian keeps things where they are." I waited for her to elaborate. She didn't. She signaled Sheila for another glass of wine and asked me if I'd tried the meatloaf at Cora's, which she said was good on Thursdays. The light on Meridian keeps things where they are. I turned this sentence over in my mind for the rest of the evening and into the next day. It was the most specific thing anyone had said to me about the Meridian practice. Everyone else had spoken in terms of preference, convenience, habit. Patricia had said something different. She had described a function. The light keeps things where they are. Things, not people. Things, where they are, as in their correct positions, in their expected locations. I began to pay closer attention to the light itself. During the day, Meridian looked like any main street. The light fixtures were modern, LED, mounted on curved steel poles at regular intervals. At night, the light they produced was white, clean even. It illuminated the street and sidewalks with a consistency that, now that I was looking for it, seemed almost clinical. There were no dark patches, no flickers, no variation in color temperature. The light from one fixture blended seamlessly into the light from the next, creating a continuous corridor of illumination that ran the entire length of town. The residential streetlights, by contrast, produced isolated pools. Each light illuminated its immediate area, but between them were stretches of relative darkness, maybe 50 or 60 feet, where the light diminished enough that you could see stars overhead, and the details of the houses softened into silhouettes. This is normal. This is how streetlights work in residential areas everywhere. But the contrast with Meridian was notable. Meridian was sealed in light. The other streets had gaps. On the following Tuesday, 17 days into my stay, I conducted an experiment. I told myself it was idle curiosity, which was partially true. But there was another part of me, the part that had kept the observation log and timed the streetlight sequence, that knew it was more deliberate than that. At 9:15 in the evening, I left my apartment and walked west to Meridian. I turned south and walked 2 blocks to 2nd Street, which ran east-west. I stopped at the corner and looked east down 2nd. It was a residential street, identical in layout to Polk. Houses on both sides, a streetlight every other block, sidewalks, parked cars, dark porches, lit windows, empty. I turned east onto 2nd Street and walked. For the first block, nothing was different from my walks on Polk. The same thin quality to my footsteps, the same maintained silence. I reached the first streetlight and paused beneath it, looking in both directions. The amber light fell on the sidewalk, the curb, the front yards of 2 houses. A parked car sat at the curb, a blue sedan with a faded bumper sticker. I couldn't read. I continued east. Between the 1st and 2nd streetlights was the gap, the 60 or so feet where the light thinned. I walked through it. The darkness wasn't complete. There was enough ambient light from the house windows and the distant glow of the other streetlights to see. But in the middle of the gap, I had a sensation that I need to describe carefully because I don't want to overstate it. The distance felt wrong. I knew this block. I'd walked it in daylight, inspecting a valve box near the corner of 2nd and Oak. The block was standard, maybe 300 feet from one intersection to the next. But walking through the gap between the 2 streetlights, the middle portion of the block felt longer than it should have. Not vastly longer, not impossibly longer, just slightly, persistently longer, as if each step covered slightly less ground than it should have. I felt like I was on one of those moving walkways in an airport, but in reverse, walking at my normal pace, but advancing more slowly. I looked ahead at the 2nd streetlight. It didn't seem to be getting closer at the rate it should. I looked behind me. The 1st streetlight was receding normally. The asymmetry was disorienting. I felt, for the first time since arriving in Harlow, genuinely uneasy. Then I stepped into the light of the 2nd streetlight, and the feeling vanished. The distance normalized. I could see the next intersection clearly, and it was exactly where it should be. I looked back the way I'd come, and the block behind me looked normal. Standard length, standard dimensions. I stood under the 2nd streetlight for a moment, then turned around and walked back to Meridian. The next morning, I drove the same block in daylight. I checked my odometer. 2nd Street between Oak and Elm was 0.06 miles. Standard. I walked it on foot. It took about 90 seconds at a normal pace. Standard. I could identify every house, every driveway, every tree. It was the same block I'd walked the night before. There was nothing wrong with it. But there had been something wrong with it. I did not repeat the experiment that night, or the next. I went to work, did my inspections, ate at Cora's, drank at the bar. I stayed on Meridian after dark and walked straight home on Polk, straight to my door, the way Curtis had told me to. I did not wander. But I thought about it. I thought about it constantly. The distance felt wrong, not in a way I could measure, not in a way I could prove, but wrong in a way I could feel in my legs, in my sense of spatial orientation, in the primitive part of the brain that tracks how far you've gone and how far you have left to go. That system, whatever you call it, proprioception, spatial awareness, internal mapping, it had reported an error. And the error occurred in the dark gap between 2 streetlights on a street that was not Meridian. On the following Friday, 20 days into my stay, something happened that shifted my understanding. I was at the bar, sitting alone, when a man I hadn't seen before sat down 2 stools away. He was younger than most of the regulars, maybe early 30s, with a beard and a canvas jacket. He ordered a whiskey and drank it fast and ordered another. He didn't talk to anyone. He didn't look around the room. He stared at the bar surface and drank. After his 3rd whiskey, he spoke without looking at me. "You're the water guy." "I am." "How long you been here?" 3 weeks. "You follow Meridian?" "I do now," I said. He nodded. He turned his glass slowly. "I grew up here," he said. "Left when I was 18. Came back last month to help my mom. She fell, broke her hip." "Sorry to hear that." "When I was a kid," he said, "I thought the Meridian thing was bullshit. Every kid does, for a while. When you're 13, 14, you want to prove it's nothing. So you go. You walk the side streets at night. You dare each other." "What happened?" He drank, set the glass down. "Most of the time, nothing. You walk, you get spooked by normal stuff. You run back to Meridian. But once, I was maybe 15, me and another kid, Tyler Reedman. We walked out to the water tower at night. It's east of Meridian, up that gravel road, maybe half a mile. I've been up there during the day. We went at night, midnight maybe, full moon. You could see pretty well. We walked the gravel road and we got to the tower and we climbed the ladder. There's a catwalk around the tank, you know. We went up there to drink beer and look at the stars." He paused, ordered another whiskey. Sheila poured it without comment. "When we were up there," he said, "I looked back at town, and it looked wrong." "Wrong how?" "The streets weren't right. The grid. You can see the whole town from up there. During the day, it looks like a grid. You can count the blocks, identify the streets. But that night, looking down, the grid didn't line up. The streets that run east-west, they were shifted, like someone had taken the blocks and pushed them a few degrees. Not a lot. Just enough that nothing was square anymore. The intersections weren't 90 degrees. They were something else. You could see that from the water tower?" "The streetlights," he said. "The residential streetlights. You could see them, and they weren't in a grid. They were in a pattern, but it wasn't the right pattern. It was like looking at a word that's misspelled. You can tell something's off, but it takes you a second to figure out what." "What about Meridian?" "Meridian was straight," he said. "Meridian was exactly where it always is. A straight line, north to south. Everything else was not." "What did Tyler say?" The man finished his whiskey. "Tyler didn't see it," he said. "Tyler was looking at the stars. I told him to look at the town, and he said it looked normal. And when I looked again, it looked normal to me too. Like it corrected. Or like my eyes adjusted. Or like I'd imagined it." He put money on the bar and stood up. "I don't think I imagined it," he said. "I think I saw what it looks like when you're outside the light." He left. I didn't see him at the bar again, though I later learned his name was Wes Dunlap, and his mother lived on Birch Street, 4 blocks east of Meridian. I spent the weekend thinking about what Wes had described. A grid that didn't align, streets that shifted, a pattern that was wrong, and Meridian, always Meridian, holding its line, straight and stable while everything around it deviated. I thought about Patricia's words. The light on Meridian keeps things where they are. I thought about my own experience on 2nd Street, the distance that felt wrong between 2 streetlights. I began to form a hypothesis, though I hesitate to use that word because it implies scientific rigor, and what I was doing was closer to intuition. The hypothesis was this: the rule about staying on Meridian at night was not a social convention. It was not a tradition with a forgotten practical origin. It was an active response to an ongoing condition, Something about Harlow's physical environment changed at night. Specifically, something about the spatial relationships between points changed. During the day, the town was a normal grid. At night, the grid became unreliable. Distances changed. Angles shifted. The geometry of the town was not fixed. Except on Meridian. Meridian, with its special lighting system, its sequential activation, its continuous corridor of white light, remained stable. The light on Meridian keeps things where they are, not a metaphor, a literal description of function. This was, I knew, insane. Spatial geometry does not change based on lighting conditions or time of day. Streets do not shift, blocks do not elongate, angles do not deviate. The physical world is consistent. That is the foundational assumption of every science, every engineering discipline, every act of navigation and construction and measurement that humans have ever performed. If that assumption were wrong, nothing would work. Buildings would not stand, roads would not connect, maps would be useless. And yet, the people of Harlow, for at least 100 years, had organized their entire nighttime existence around a single street, not out of superstition, not out of fear, out of practice, out of the kind of quiet, inherited, unquestioned knowledge that comes from living in a place and learning its rules. Not its written rules, its actual rules, the rules the place itself enforces. I had 3 weeks left on my contract in Harlow. My inspection work was nearly complete. I could have finished my reports, submitted them to the county, and moved on to the next town on my rotation. I should have. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. Instead, on the following Tuesday night, 24 days into my stay, I left my apartment at 10:15 and walked west to Meridian. I stood under the streetlight at the corner of Meridian and Polk for a moment, looking north and south. The street was quieter than usual. A man was walking a dog a block south. No one else was visible. I turned east onto Polk and walked, past Mrs. Garland's house, past the next house and the next. I reached the first dark gap, the stretch between streetlights, and walked through it. My footsteps were thin and high. The distance felt normal, maybe slightly long. I wasn't sure. I kept walking. I reached the second streetlight and continued past it, into the next gap, across the next intersection. I was now on a part of Polk I'd only been on in daylight, 4 blocks east of Meridian, where the houses were smaller and the lots were larger. The streetlights here were spaced further apart, and the gaps between them were longer and darker. I walked through a gap that must have been 80 feet. I counted my steps. In daylight, I have a stride of roughly 30 inches. 80 feet should be about 32 steps. I counted 41. I was covering less ground per step, or the ground was covering more distance per block. I reached the next streetlight and stopped. I turned around. The streetlights behind me, stretching west toward Meridian, were visible, but they didn't look right. They were spaced unevenly. The first one behind me was where I expected it to be, but the second one beyond it, which should have been about 150 feet further, looked closer, and the one beyond that looked further. The spacing was irregular, as if the street behind me had been compressed in some places and stretched in others. I looked ahead, east. One more streetlight was visible, then darkness. Beyond that, the edge of town, the fields. I looked at the houses around me. They were dark porched, lit within. A TV flickered behind a curtain in the house to my left. The house to my right had a light on in what looked like a kitchen. Normal houses, normal night. But the street between them was not normal. I could feel it now, not just in the distance between lights, but in the quality of the space itself. It had a give to it, a flexibility. The way a surface feels when it's not quite solid, when there's something beneath it that yields. I was standing on a sidewalk, on concrete, on a built thing. But the space the sidewalk occupied felt provisional, like it was being held in shape by something, and that something was not absolute. I took 3 steps east, away from the streetlight, into the next gap. The darkness closed around me. Not dramatically, not like a curtain falling. Just the normal progression from light to dark as you move away from a light source. But in the darkness, the street felt wider. The houses on either side felt further away. I could still see them, their lit windows, but the distance between me and them felt greater than the width of a residential lot. Greater than the 30 or 40 feet from sidewalk to house that I'd measured in daylight. I stopped. I stood in the dark middle of Polk Street and listened. There was a sound, not loud, not sudden. A low, continuous sound that I can only describe as spatial. It was the sound of distance. The sound of a large, open space that has no walls and no ceiling and no floor, but is nevertheless enclosed. Like standing in an enormous room whose boundaries you cannot see. A vast, contained hum, not mechanical, not natural, geometric. I turned around and walked back toward the streetlight. It took me 12 steps. I had walked 3 steps into the gap. The return should have been 3 steps. It was 12. I reached the light and stood under it and looked at my hands. They were shaking. Not from cold, from something my body understood before my mind did. I was standing in a place that did not obey fixed rules of distance and direction. The streetlight was an island of consistency in a medium that was, at night, plastic, mutable. The light from this sodium fixture, this old, yellowish, underpowered light, was holding a small circle of space in its correct configuration. Inside its radius, 3 steps was 3 steps. Outside its radius, 3 steps was 12, or 41, or more. I walked back to Meridian. I did not run. I wanted to run, but I did not. I walked at a measured pace, staying on the sidewalk, moving from one streetlight to the next. Each gap between lights was longer than it should have been. Not wildly longer. Not hallucinatory. Just persistently, measurably wrong. A 150-foot gap would take me 30 or 40 extra steps. The distance was elastic. It stretched in the dark and contracted in the light. I reached Meridian and stepped onto it, and the elasticity stopped. The sidewalk was firm. The distance between me and the next streetlight was exactly what it should be. I walked to the corner of Meridian and Polk and stood there, breathing, looking east down Polk where I'd come from. The street looked normal. The streetlights were spaced evenly. The houses were where they should be. But I had been on that street, in those gaps, and I knew what I'd felt. The town at night was not a fixed thing. It was something that could change shape, and Meridian was the spine that held it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch in my apartment and wrote down everything I'd experienced, every measurement, every count, every sensation. I filled 4 pages of a legal pad. When dawn came, I went outside and walked the route I'd taken the night before. Every distance was correct. Every block was standard. The town was a grid, a perfect, ordinary grid. I considered leaving. I want to be honest about that. I considered packing my truck, driving to the county office, and telling them I needed to be reassigned. I had a reason. I could say I'd gotten sick. I could say there was a family emergency. No one would question it. But I didn't leave. And the reason I didn't leave is the same reason I took the walk in the first place. The same reason I kept the log and timed the streetlights and asked the questions. I needed to understand. Not in the abstract, theoretical sense. In the lived, physical sense. I needed to know what Harlow was. What the people of Harlow had been accommodating for a century. What the light on Meridian was holding in place. 3 days passed. I finished my water system report and submitted it to Dale. He reviewed it, thanked me, and said my work in Harlow was essentially complete. I had until the following Friday before I was due in the next town on my rotation, a place called Denning, 40 miles south. I had almost a week of free time. On Thursday evening, 28 days into my stay, I drove to the water tower. It was 8:40 when I parked at the base. The Meridian streetlights had completed their sequence. The tower loomed above me, a standard municipal water tank on steel legs, maybe 100 feet to the catwalk. The ladder was on the east side. There was a locked gate at the bottom, but the lock was old and the hasp was loose, and I had a wrench in my truck. I'm not proud of this. It was trespassing. But I climbed. The ladder was cold. The rungs were narrow. I didn't look down until I reached the catwalk. Then I looked. The view was exactly as Wes had described it. From up here, the town was laid out below me, a grid of streets and houses and lights. Meridian was a bright line running north to south, its white lights forming a continuous seam. The residential streets branched off both sides, their amber streetlights dotting the dark blocks at regular intervals. At first, everything looked normal. The grid was a grid. The angles were square. The intersections were right angles. I could identify the streets by counting blocks from Meridian. Poke, Oak, Elm, Birch, Maple, Cedar to the east. 1st through 6th to the west. The school at the north end, a dark shape with a single security light. The church on Elm, its stained glass window faintly glowing. Then I stopped looking at landmarks and started looking at the spaces between them. The dark spaces, the gaps between streetlights, the blocks and yards and empty lots. They were moving. Not quickly, not in a way that would be visible if you glanced and looked away. But if you held your gaze on a single dark area, a single gap between two streetlights, and watched it, really watched it, you could see it. The darkness in that space was not static. It had a slow, almost tidal movement to it, a drift. The edges of the light pools from the streetlights were shifting, subtly, like the edges of water on a very flat beach when a gentle wave comes in. The light would seem to extend a few inches further, then recede, and the dark space between the lights would expand and contract in response. The houses didn't move. The streetlights didn't move. The physical structures were fixed, but the space between them, the actual distance, was breathing. That's the only word for it. The town was breathing at night, not fast, not obviously, but measurably, visibly, from up here, if you watched. And Meridian was not breathing. Meridian was rigid. Its lights were fixed. Its distances were constant. The white line ran from the north end of town to the south end, and it did not move. It was the one constant in a landscape of subtle, ongoing spatial fluctuation. I watched for a long time, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour. The breathing was hypnotic. It had a rhythm, not a regular rhythm, not a heartbeat. Something more complex, like overlapping waves from different sources. Some blocks would expand while others contracted. Some gaps would lengthen while adjacent ones shortened. The overall area of the town, if you could have measured it moment to moment, was probably constant. It was just being redistributed. Space was flowing within the grid, pooling in some places, thinning in others, always in motion, always changing. And the residents of Harlow, in their lit houses behind their drawn curtains, were inside this. They were embedded in a spatial medium that was not stable. Their houses were fixed points, anchored by their foundations, their weight, their physical presence. But the space between the houses was fluid. If you stepped outside, if you walked into that fluid space, you would be subject to its movement. Distances would change, directions would shift. You might walk 3 steps and cover 12, or you might walk 100 steps and go nowhere, unless you were on Meridian, where the light kept things where they were. I climbed down from the water tower. It was past 10. I got in my truck and drove back down the gravel road to Meridian. The gravel road was maybe half a mile. In daylight, I'd driven it in about a minute. That night, it took nearly 4 minutes. My headlights showed the gravel surface, the weeds on either side, the fence posts of a property boundary. Everything looked normal. But the road was longer than it should have been. I checked my odometer. It read 0.8 miles when I reached Meridian. The gravel road was half a mile. My odometer said 0.8. The road had been 60% longer than its daytime length. I parked on Meridian outside Cora's and sat in my truck for a long time. The diner was dark. The street was quiet. A cat sat on the sidewalk across the street, cleaning its paw. The streetlights were white and steady. Everything was where it should be. I drove home. I parked in front of Mrs. Garland's house on Polk. I got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street. It looked normal, but I knew, with a certainty that went beyond evidence, that between me and Mrs. Garland's front door, the space was not fixed. I was standing in a medium that was in motion. The sidewalk under my feet was concrete, and it was real, and it was solid. But the distance between where I stood and the porch steps, maybe 25 feet, was a provisional number. It might be 25 feet. It might be 30. It might be 18. The space was moving, slowly, subtly, like water in a very deep pool that looks still on the surface but has currents underneath. I walked to the door. It took me an appropriate number of steps. I went inside. The next morning, I did something I hadn't planned. I went to the Harlow Town Office, a small building on Meridian, between the post office and the hardware store, and asked to see the town records. Specifically, I asked for anything related to the Meridian streetlight system. The town clerk was a woman named Dorothy, who seemed neither surprised nor suspicious about my request. She was accustomed to people from the Water Authority asking for infrastructure records. She pulled a file box from a back shelf and handed it to me. The file contained the grant application Dale had mentioned, dated 11 years earlier. The town had applied for and received a state infrastructure improvement grant for the purpose of upgrading street lighting on its primary commercial corridor. The application was standard, boilerplate language about safety and visibility and economic vitality. Attached to it was a specification sheet for the lighting system, which included the make and model of the fixtures, the pole spacing, the wattage, and the control system. The control system was described as a sequential luminary activation system with maintained light level management. I'd never seen that specific language in a streetlight specification before. Maintained light level management, not automatic. Not sensor-based, maintained. By what? By whom? The specification sheet referenced an installation contractor based in a city I didn't recognize, listed as Faisal Illumination, LLC. I wrote down the name and, back at my apartment, searched for it online. I found nothing. No website, no business registration, no reviews, no address. The company, as far as the internet was concerned, did not exist. I went back to the town office that afternoon and asked Dorothy if there were any older records about the town's nighttime practices. Specifically, I asked if there were any council minutes or ordinances related to the use of the main road after dark. Dorothy looked at me. Her expression was different from the others I'd encountered. She didn't look puzzled. She looked careful. "You've noticed how things work here," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have. And you've been on the other streets at night." I hesitated. Then, "Yes." She nodded. She didn't seem alarmed. She went to a different shelf and pulled down a binder. an old one with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. "These are from the early days," she said, 19 teens and 20s, back when the railroad was still here. She opened the binder to a page marked with a faded ribbon. It was a handwritten record of a town meeting, dated March 14th, 1919. The handwriting was formal, careful, the work of a trained clerk. Most of the meeting was routine: road repair, a dispute about a property line, a request for a new well. But at the bottom of the page, there was an entry that read, "Mr. Harlan Peck raised the matter of nighttime movement in the town and proposed that the council formally recommend that all residents and visitors confine their after-dark activities to the railroad corridor and its immediately adjacent structures." Mr. Peck cited the ongoing and well-known instability of the outlying streets during nighttime hours and suggested that a formal recommendation would serve to protect newcomers and visitors who may not be aware of the condition. The proposal was seconded by Mrs. Ada Whitfield. A vote was taken. The proposal passed unanimously. The clerk was instructed to post notice at the depot and the general store. The ongoing and well-known instability of the outlying streets during nighttime hours. I read the sentence 3 times. I looked at Dorothy. She was watching me with an expression of something I can only call weary recognition. The look of someone who has shown this page to a handful of people over the years and watched them arrive at the same place I was arriving. "Instability," I said. "That's what they called it," she said. "That's what it is, I suppose." "What causes it?" "Nobody knows. Nobody's ever known. It's been this way as long as the town's been here, probably before. The original settlers noticed it. You build on a piece of land, and during the day, it stays built. At night, the distances change. Not the buildings, not the structures, just the space between them. Mr. Peck, the one in the minutes, he was an engineer. He took measurements. He drove stakes into the ground at measured intervals and checked them at night with a lantern on a rope. The distances between the stakes changed after dark. Not by a lot, a few percent, but consistently. And the further you got from the railroad tracks, the more the distances changed. And the railroad tracks were stable? The tracks were laid on a gravel bed that ran straight through town, north to south. They were heavy: iron rails, wooden ties, crushed stone, and the trains ran on them, keeping them in use, keeping them loaded. The theory, if you can call it that, was that the physical weight and activity on the tracks anchored the space, kept it fixed. When the railroad left in 23, the town paved over the rail bed and kept the road active, kept it lit. When the old lights weren't enough, they upgraded, and upgraded again. "Phasal illumination," I said. Dorothy blinked. "You found the name." "In the grant file, the installation contractor. There's no record of them anywhere." "No," she said. "There wouldn't be." "Who are they?" "I don't know. Dale handled the installation. The county processed the grant. The company sent a crew, 4 men, no uniforms, no trucks with logos. They installed the system in 3 days and left. Dale has a phone number. He's called it twice in 11 years. Both times when a fixture malfunctioned. Both times someone came within 24 hours and fixed it." "Someone from where?" "I don't know." I looked at the binder page again. The ongoing and well-known instability. Well-known. In 1919, it was already well-known. Already an accepted feature of the landscape, like the soil composition or the water table depth. Not a mystery, not a legend. A condition. "Why don't people talk about it?" I asked. Dorothy closed the binder. "What would they say? The space between our houses changes at night. The streets get longer and shorter. No one would believe them, and if they did, no one would come here. No one would buy property. No one would send their kids to our school. The town would die. She put the binder back on the shelf. So, we do what we've always done. We stay on Meridian at night. We keep our porch lights off because the light from the porch fixtures isn't strong enough to stabilize the yards, and the contrast between a lit porch and a dark street actually makes the instability harder to navigate. We go inside. We draw our curtains. And we don't talk about it to people who aren't going to be here long enough for it to matter. But you're talking to me. You've been on the streets at night, she said. You've felt it. You already know. Telling you isn't a risk. Telling you is just confirming what your body already understands. I left the town office and walked to Cora's and ordered coffee and sat at the counter and didn't drink it. I sat there for 45 minutes. Jackie refilled my cup once and left me alone. I had 2 days left before I was due in Denning. I should have spent them packing and organizing my reports. Instead, I spent them on Meridian after dark, walking the length of the street, observing. Now that I knew what I was looking at, I saw things I'd missed before. The people who used Meridian at night didn't walk casually. They walked with purpose, not rushing, but efficient. Point A to point B, no detours, no lingering. The man walking his dog kept the dog on a short leash and stayed in the center of the sidewalk, as far from the edges of the light as possible. The teenagers on the bench in front of the post office sat under the brightest part of the nearest streetlight. Their bench positioned, I now realized, at the exact midpoint between two fixtures where the overlapping light was strongest. And the lights themselves. I watched them from different angles, different positions. The white light they produced was not just bright, it was dense. That's the best word I can find. It had a substance to it, a weight that the amber residential lights lacked. Standing under a Meridian streetlight, I felt the same solidity I felt during the day. The absolute certainty that the ground beneath me was the ground beneath me, that the distance to the next corner was what it appeared to be, that the laws of geometry applied without exception. Step beyond that light, onto a side street, and that certainty began to soften. Not disappear, soften, like a signal losing strength. On my last night in Harlow, I went to the bar. It was a Wednesday. Quiet. Sheila poured me a beer. Curtis was there, and Patricia, and a few people I recognized but hadn't spoken to. I drank slowly and didn't ask any more questions. At 10 o'clock, I paid my tab and left. I stood on Meridian in the white light and looked at the town. I looked south, where the lit corridor ran to the edge of Harlow, and stopped. I looked north, where it ran to the other edge, and stopped. Beyond the town, in both directions, the state road continued into the dark, unlit, unsupported. I wondered what the instability was like out there, in the fields, on the open road, where there were no streetlights at all, whether the distances between here and the next town were the same at night as they were during the day, whether anyone had measured. I walked home, east on Polk, straight to the door. I felt the softness of the space around me, the gentle elasticity of the distance between streetlights. I didn't count my steps this time. I didn't need to. I knew what was happening. The space was moving. It was always moving. It moved during the day too, probably, but so slightly that no instrument and no human sense could detect it. At night, the movement increased. Not because of darkness itself, but because darkness was the absence of the thing that held the space in place. Light. Specific light. The right light, with the right density, in the right configuration. I reached Mrs. Garland's door. I went inside. I climbed the stairs. I looked out the window at Meridian, and then at Polk, and then at the Petersons' house to the east, and then at the sky. The stars were wrong. Not all of them. Not in a way that was immediately obvious. but the constellations I could see through the east window were slightly deformed. Orion's belt, which I know as well as I know my own hands, was not 3 stars in a straight line. It was 3 stars in a very slight curve, as if the space between me and Orion had a lens in it, a subtle warping that bent the light by a fraction of a degree. I looked out the west window toward Meridian. Orion was visible there too, higher in the sky. His belt was straight. I pulled a chair to the east window and sat and watched the stars for an hour. The distortion was constant, subtle but constant. Every constellation I could identify was slightly wrong, not randomly wrong, consistently wrong, as if viewed through a medium that was very slightly inhomogeneous, like looking at a straight stick half submerged in water. The stick appears bent because light moves at different speeds in air and water. The stars appeared distorted because light was moving at different speeds through whatever the space around Harlow was made of. I did not sleep that night either. In the morning, I packed my truck. I loaded my equipment, my files, my clothes. I went downstairs and thanked Mrs. Garland and left the key on her kitchen table. She wished me well and offered me a jar of raspberry preserves from her garden, which I accepted. I drove to the Public Works building and said goodbye to Dale. He shook my hand and said the town appreciated my work. I asked him, casually, almost as an afterthought, if the instability had ever gotten worse. He looked at me. He didn't ask what I meant. "Some years are worse than others," he said. "Last February was bad. People couldn't find their own driveways coming home from Meridian. Woman on Cedar Street said her backyard was 100 feet deep instead of 40. Her dog went out there and she didn't see it again for 3 days. When it came back, it was thinner and its fur was wet, though it hadn't rained." "What do you think is out there?" I asked. "In the space that moves?" Dale leaned against his truck. He was quiet for a long time. "I don't think anything's out there," he said. "I think that's the problem. I think the space out there at night isn't finished. It's not filled in. It's just distance without anything in it. You walk into it and you're not going somewhere. You're just going and not arriving, because there's nothing to arrive at. It's space that doesn't have a destination, just extent." He looked at the sky, which was clear and blue and normal. Meridian holds because it's been held for 100 years. The tracks held it, then the road, then the lights. It's been used and maintained and weighted down by people and activity and intention. The rest of the town holds during the day because the sun is strong enough to stabilize everything. But at night, without the sun, only Meridian has enough light to keep the space coherent. The rest of it goes loose. "Goes loose," I repeated. "Like a rope that's not tied to anything," he said. "It's still a rope. It's still there, but it can drift." I drove south out of Harlow on Meridian, which became the state road. It was 10 in the morning. The road was straight and flat, and the soybean fields stretched to the horizon on both sides. Everything was where it should be. The distance to Denning was 40 miles, and my odometer confirmed it precisely. I've been in Denning for 3 weeks now. It's a normal town. The streets are used at all hours. The geometry is fixed. I check. I've been checking every night. I measure distances with a tape measure I keep in my truck. I walk routes and count steps. Everything is consistent. Denning is a normal place. But I haven't been able to stop thinking about Harlow, about the breathing I saw from the water tower, about the distances that changed, about the stars through the east window, about Dale's image of a rope untied, drifting. I've started to notice things that are probably nothing. In Denning, at night, the walk from my motel to the gas station across the road sometimes feels like it takes 1 or 2 steps more than it should. The distance between 2 telephone poles on the street outside my window seems different depending on when I look at it. A car parked at the curb appears to be slightly further from the curb in the morning than it was the night before, though it hasn't moved. These are small things, negligible things, the kind of things a rational person would attribute to fatigue, or inattention, or the natural imprecision of human perception. But I've started carrying a tape measure in my pocket, and I've started, without deciding to, walking down the main street of Denning at night instead of using the side streets. I stay in the brightest light. I walk with purpose. I don't linger in the gaps. Last night, I stood on the main street of Denning at 11 o'clock and looked north, toward Harlow, 40 miles away. The sky was clear. The stars were out. I found Orion. I looked at his belt. It might have been straight. It might have been very, very slightly curved. I looked away. I have 11 more towns on my contract, 11 more grids of streets, 11 more sets of streetlights, 11 more places where I'll walk the roads and open valve boxes and measure things. And in each one, I'll be measuring more than pipe conditions and flow rates. I'll be measuring the space, counting my steps, comparing distances, checking the stars. Because here is what I can't stop thinking about, the thing that keeps me awake, the thing that has settled into me like cold water into stone. Harlow is not the only place where the space is loose. Harlow is just the only place that knows it, the only place where the instability is pronounced enough that people noticed 100 years ago and built a system to manage it. A lit road, a single straight line, an anchor. What about the places where the instability is smaller? A few inches instead of a few feet, a few seconds of extra walking instead of a few minutes. What about the places where the drift is so subtle that no one has ever measured it, because no one thought to? What about every small town on every rural road, in every empty stretch of country, where the streets are quiet at night and the distances are never checked? What if the ground is loose everywhere, and most of us just haven't noticed because we've never looked down? I stay on the main streets now, in every town. I stay in the light. I walk straight to my door and I don't wander. I don't know if it helps. I don't know if the light in these other towns is the right kind of light, or if the streets are maintained, or if anything is holding the space together. But I follow the rule, Harlow's rule, the one that was never written down, never explained, never questioned. You stay on the lit road after dark. You don't go on the other streets. You don't wander. And you don't look too carefully at the distance between where you are and where you're going, because if you measure it, if you really measure it, you might find that it's not what it was a moment ago. And once you know that, you can't unknow it. You carry it with you. It becomes the lens through which you see every road, every block, every stretch of dark pavement between one pool of light and the next. The space is moving. It's always been moving. The light holds it still sometimes in some places, if the light is strong enough and constant enough, and someone has thought to maintain it. And in all the other places, in all the dark gaps, the space is just distance without destination, extent without anchor, a rope untied from both ends, drifting in a current you can't see. I stay on meridian. Even when there is no meridian, I stay on it. I think you should too.